In 1975, an American subway train operator disappeared in the middle of his shift, leaving his family with nothing but shame and a story that he had abandoned them. For 40 years, that was the official lie. Then, during a routine repair, city workers broke through a concrete wall they never knew existed. Deep underground, they found his train in a sealed tunnel, a steel ghost, untouched by time. But it was a leather logbook left on the control panel that turned a city mystery into a chilling conspiracy. The final entry, written in a shaky hand, read, "They won't let me leave." He didn't run. He was silenced. What secret was so terrifying that a man and his entire train had to be buried in the dark and completely erased from history? Subscribe now so you won't miss similar chilling stories on our channel in the future. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The air in the tunnel was thick with the dust of forgotten years, a stale, metallic breath that had not mixed with the world above since the city's fathers were young men. It was 2015, and the maintenance crew, sweating under the harsh glare of their work lights, thought they were just chasing a phantom electrical short. Their ground-penetrating radar had shown an anomaly, a void behind a concrete retaining wall that wasn't on any modern blueprint. The foreman, a man named Henderson whose grandfather had helped lay these same tracks, gave the order to drill. The bit screamed, then punched through into nothing, a hollow space. An hour later they had a hole big enough for a man to crawl through. What they found inside silenced them all. It was a subway car, a relic from the 1970s, sitting on a forgotten stretch of track in a tunnel that had been sealed, deliberately and completely, from the rest of the system. Rust had bled down its sides in long, weeping streaks, but otherwise it was perfectly preserved, a ghost ship in a bottle of stone and earth. Henderson climbed aboard, his boots echoing in the dead silence. Everything was coated in a fine gray dust, a shroud 40 years thick. He ran his glove over the operator's console, and through the grime he saw it. A small, leather-bound logbook, lying open as if the driver had just stepped away for a moment. He picked it up, the leather stiff and cold. The last entry, dated October 14, 1975, was written in a frantic, spidery script. The pen strokes dug deep into the yellowed page. It was only 2 sentences. "They won't let me leave," it read. "Tell my boy I kept the promise." 52-year-old Anna Reyes moved through the quiet, sterile halls of St. Jude's Hospital with a practiced calm. She was a nurse, had been for 30 years, and the rhythms of healing and grieving were as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She smoothed the blanket over an elderly patient, her touch gentle, her smile a small, steady light in the dim room. She had built her life on a foundation of quiet service and unwavering reliability, a silent rebellion against the story that had defined her childhood, the story of a father who was not reliable, a father who, on a clear autumn night in 1975, had simply walked away from his train, his job, and his family and vanished into thin air. Desertion, the officials had called it, a quiet, clinical word for a wound that had never stopped bleeding. Anna had been 12. Her brother, Luis, was just 7. The shame had settled over their family like a permanent winter frost. A father who runs. It was a brand, a stain that followed you through school, through friendships, through life. You learned to live with it, to build walls around the hollow space he'd left behind. You poured yourself into your work, your own children, now your grandchildren. You became the one who never leaves. She was in the staff break room, her back aching from a 12-hour shift, when the local news flickered on the small television mounted in the corner. She was barely paying attention, stirring sugar into a cup of lukewarm coffee, when a familiar image flashed on the screen. The old rounded front of a 1970s subway car. Anna froze, spoon hovering over her cup. The reporter's voice was filled with a breathless excitement that made Anna's stomach tighten. "A stunning discovery deep beneath the city," he was saying. "A time capsule, a ghost train, sealed away for decades." They showed footage of the crew foreman, Henderson, his face grim under the bright TV lights. He was holding something up, encased in a clear evidence bag, a small, dark book. "The most chilling part of this discovery," the reporter continued, his voice dropping for dramatic effect, "is the operator's logbook, found on the control panel. The missing operator was identified as Miguel Reyes." Anna's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the linoleum floor. The sound was deafening in her ears, but she didn't notice. Her father's name. After 40 years of silence, his name was on the news. Her coworkers turned to stare at the spreading pool of coffee, but Anna couldn't move. She was pinned to the spot, her eyes locked on the television, her heart hammering against her ribs. They put the final logbook entry on the screen, a high-resolution photo of the shaky, desperate words. "They won't let me leave. Tell my boy I kept the promise. Tell my boy, Luis. He kept the promise." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. A lie. It was all a lie. The story of the man who ran, the coward who abandoned his wife and children without a word, it was a fiction crafted to cover something terrible. He didn't run. They wouldn't let him leave. The shame that had been her constant companion for 40 years began to burn away, replaced by a white-hot rage that was so pure and so powerful it left her breathless. He hadn't left them. He had been taken from them, silenced, buried. In that moment, watching the news report in a sterile hospital break room, a vow took root in Anna's soul. She would find the truth. Not just for him, but for the 12-year-old girl who had waited by the window for a father who never came home. She would give him back his name, whatever the cost. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial the numbers. She needed to tell Luis. He needed to know. Their father wasn't a ghost of shame, he was a victim, a man who had fought. He would feel it too, this sudden, earth-shattering relief, this vindication. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice gruff. "Anna, what's wrong?" He was a mechanic, and he was probably still at the shop, his hands covered in grease. She could picture him perfectly, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. "Luis?" she said, her own voice sounding foreign and strangled. "Turn on the news. Channel 7, now." She heard a clatter in the background, then muffled sounds as he found a remote. A few seconds of silence stretched into a minute. She could hear the tinny sound of the television broadcast through his phone. Then, his voice, low and sharp. "Turn it off, Anna." It wasn't the reaction she expected. There was no shock, no relief, only ice. "What? Luis? Did you hear what they said? He didn't leave us. They stopped him. They buried him." "I said, turn it off," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. 40 years, Anna. 40 years we have had peace. Do you have any idea what this is going to do? They're going to dig it all up again. The reporters, the whispers, the looks from strangers. I just got my life quiet. Don't you dare do this to my family. His words were a bucket of ice water, extinguishing the fire that had just begun to burn in her. "Do what to your family?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "This is our family. This is about Dad. Dad is gone," he half shouted, the sound cracking with an ancient pain. "He left us with nothing but his name and a story that made people pity us. I finally got out from under that shadow, and now you want to go stand in the middle of a media circus and bring it all back? For what? A ghost story? For a man who isn't here?" The accusation behind his words was clear. "You're being selfish. You're reopening wounds for your own sake, without a thought for the rest of us." The fragile bond that had held them together for decades, a bond built on the shared silence of their father's absence, suddenly felt terrifyingly thin. "It wasn't a ghost story, Luis. It was a lie," she whispered, pleading with him to understand. "He was trying to tell you something. I kept the promise. He was talking to you." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. For a fleeting, hopeful moment she thought she'd reached him. Then he spoke, and his voice was flat, hollowed out. "I don't want to know, Anna. Let the dead stay buried. Some things are better left alone." And then he hung up. The dial tone buzzed in her ear, a cold, empty sound. She stood alone in the break room, the shattered cup at her feet, the ghost of her father in the air, and the brother she loved now, a wall of anger and fear. The truth had finally surfaced, but it hadn't brought relief. It had brought a new war, and the first battle was not with a faceless city official, but with the only family she had left. Luis's words had left a void where her brother used to be. For 2 days, Anna walked through her life in a daze, the world muted and distant. The hospital corridors felt longer, the hum of the machinery louder, her patient's pain more acute. Her righteous anger had cooled into a familiar, lonely ache. Luis was right about one thing. She was reopening a wound. But he was wrong about it ever having healed. It had festered in the dark for 40 years, poisoning everything. She couldn't leave it there. Not now. She needed help, but not from the police, who had written the first and last chapter of the official lie. She needed someone who remembered the beginning. Someone who had been there in 1975 and had seen the story when it was fresh. An old name surfaced from the depths of her memory, a name her mother used to say, with a mix of hope and frustration. Harold Blake, the reporter from the City Chronicle who had written a series of articles about the disappearance before the official verdict, shut him down. A quick search online confirmed he was still alive, retired, living in a small bungalow on the city's east side. Anna called in sick for the first time in a decade, her voice steady but her heart racing. She was a nurse. She fixed things. And this was the most broken thing in her life. Harold Blake's house smelled of old paper, pipe, tobacco, and regret. Stacks of yellowing newspapers and teetering towers of file boxes filled every available surface, a fortress built of forgotten headlines. When he opened the door, he looked at Anna with the weary, guarded eyes of a man who had seen too many stories end badly. He was in his mid-70s, his frame stooped, but his gaze was still sharp, analytical. He recognized her name instantly. "Reyes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I haven't heard that name in a long time. Come in." Inside, he cleared a space for her on a dusty armchair. He didn't offer her coffee. He just watched her, waiting. She told him everything: the discovery of the train, the logbook, the final, desperate message, the phone call with her brother. She spoke with a quiet, clinical precision, the way she would deliver a difficult diagnosis, holding her own emotions in a tight fist. When she was finished, the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of 4 decades. Harold leaned back, his eyes unfocused, looking at a past only he could see. "I never believed it," he said softly. "Your father, he wasn't the type to run. He was a union man, a family man, disciplined. The whole desertion story felt neat, too neat. The city wanted the case closed, and that was the tidiest bow they could put on it." A flicker of warmth spread through Anna's chest. For the first time, she wasn't alone in her belief. Here was a stranger who saw the same man she did. "There was a lot of pressure back then," Harold continued, his eyes meeting hers. "Big expansion projects. The city was cutting corners on safety, and the union was pushing back hard. Your father was one of the loudest voices. Then he vanished, and the protests just fizzled out. It was convenient." He stood up and shuffled over to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick, dusty folder. "I kept my files, all of them." He laid it on the coffee table between them. Miguel Reyes' disappearance. Hope, sharp and breathtaking, rose in Anna's throat. It was a tangible thing, a promise written in faded ink. She had found an ally. With Harold's old laminated press pass and a few well-placed calls to contacts who still owed him favors, they gained access to the excavation site the next day. It was a chaotic scene of city workers, engineers, and a handful of police officers keeping a perimeter against the curious press. The sealed tunnel entrance was a jagged maw in the concrete, a raw wound ripped open after 40 years. The air that breathed from it was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and rust. This was it. The place where her father's world had ended. Harold put a steadying hand on her arm. "You ready for this, kid?" he asked gently. She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. An officer escorted them past the tape to the train car itself. It stood silent and immense in the temporary floodlights, its paint peeling, its windows clouded with grime. The officer gave them 5 minutes and a pair of disposable gloves. Climbing the steps into the operator's cabin was like stepping into a photograph. The layer of dust was a delicate gray blanket over everything, preserving the scene exactly as it had been left. The seat, the control levers, a half-empty cup of coffee turned to sludge on a small shelf. It was a tomb, and she felt like a trespasser desecrating a sacred space. Her father had sat in this very seat. His hands had held these controls. He had looked out this window into the endless dark of the tunnels. The feeling was so overwhelming she had to brace herself against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. While Harold examined the logbook, still in an evidence bag on the console, Anna's gaze swept the small space. She was looking for him, for some piece of him that wasn't a ghost, and then she saw it. Tucked deep under the driver's seat, almost invisible against the grimy floor, was a glint of metal. Her heart pounded. She knelt down, her knees cracking, and reached a gloved hand into the darkness. Her fingers closed around something small, cool, and solid. She pulled it out into the light. It was a brass whistle on a frayed leather lanyard. She turned it over. Engraved on the side, in small, neat letters, were his initials, M.R. Miguel Reyes. It was his. The whistle he wore for every single shift, the one he'd let her and Luis blow when they were children, its shrill sound echoing in their small house. It was a part of him. And it wasn't on him when he supposedly walked away. It was here, hidden under his seat. The official report from 1975 stated that Miguel Reyes had clocked out, left all his work equipment in his locker, and simply never come home. But this whistle proved that was a lie. He had never left his post. He had been here, in this cab, until the very end. The proof was cold and heavy in her hand, a solid piece of truth in a world of shadows. Tears welled in her eyes, not of grief, but of fierce, triumphant vindication. "Harold," she whispered, her voice thick. "Look." As they stepped out of the tunnel and back into the harsh light of the afternoon, a sleek black town car pulled up to the edge of the police tape, gliding to a silent stop. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit emerged. He was in his 60s, with a confident smile, silver hair, and the easy posture of someone who was accustomed to being in charge. He moved with a practiced, politician's grace. As he approached them, Anna felt an involuntary chill, a primal sense of warning that had nothing to do with the cool air from the tunnel. The man extended a hand to Harold first, then to her. His handshake was firm, his skin smooth. "Harold Blake," he said, his voice a polished, friendly baritone. "It's been a long time. Richard Kessler, City Transport Director." Kessler. The name meant nothing to Anna, but she saw a flicker of recognition and distaste in Harold's eyes. Kessler's gaze settled on Anna, his smile softening with practiced empathy. "And you must be Anna Reyes. I am so terribly sorry for what your family must be going through, having all this dredged up again." The sympathy felt manufactured, hollow. Harold, ever the reporter, got straight to the point. "Director Kessler, my colleague and I were just inside. We found something that contradicts the official 1975 report." Harold gestured to the whistle in Anna's hand. "That is Miguel Reyes' service whistle. It was found under his seat. He never left his train." Kessler's eyes flicked to the whistle, his smile never wavering. It was a masterful performance of disinterest. He took out a slim gold fountain pen from his breast pocket and began to tap it rhythmically against his thumb. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was small, but it cut through the noise of the work site. "An interesting find," he said, his voice losing a fraction of its warmth. "But the city conducted a thorough investigation 40 years ago. The case is closed. While this discovery is a fascinating historical curiosity, I assure you it changes nothing." His dismissal was so complete, so absolute, it was like a slap in the face. He was telling her that her truth didn't matter, that this piece of her father in her hand was nothing. Then he turned his full attention to Anna, and the friendly mask slipped just enough for her to see the cold calculation beneath. His voice lowered, becoming intimate, conspiratorial. "Miss Reyes," he said, leaning in slightly. "A piece of advice, from someone who understands how this city works. You're a respected nurse. You have a family. Let this go." The words were calm, but they landed like a threat. "Sometimes," he continued, the tapping of his pen, a steady, unnerving metronome, "the stories we tell ourselves are kinder than the truth. Do you really want to risk your father's memory? Because right now, he is a man who made a sad choice. If you keep digging, you might tarnish his name far more than that. You risk slandering his memory in ways you can't even imagine. He gave her one last pitying smile, then turned and walked back to his car. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't a warning about her own safety. It was worse. He was threatening her father's legacy, the very thing she was fighting to save. He was telling her that the lie was a mercy and the truth would be a monster. The brass whistle in her palm suddenly felt very cold, no longer a symbol of victory, but a dangerous, heavy secret. Richard Kessler's polite, tailored threat had done two things. It had filled Anna with justifiable outrage at his cynical attempt to crush her search, and it had pointed her in a very specific direction. He hadn't denied that something was covered up. He had simply warned that the discovery of the truth might be uglier than the lie. If the key wasn't in the tunnels, it had to be in the city's records from the tumultuous era of 1975. They needed to find the genesis of the corruption. That evening, back in the sanctuary of Harold's file-stuffed bungalow, they worked late, fueled by stale coffee and Anna's renewed determination. Harold pulled out brittle Fox newspaper clippings he had collected decades ago. He scattered them across his dining table, creating a panoramic view of a city struggling with rapid, expensive expansion. Anna looked at the grainy photos of men in hard hats, of new steel curving into the darkness. Most articles spoke of progress and the future, but a few, often tucked into the lower corners of the pages, hinted at discord. Anna felt the rise of hope as she pored over the details. Harold pointed to a headline from September of 1975, "Union demands safety review as tunnel accidents spike." Anna traced the faded ink, suddenly immersed in the atmosphere of 40 years past. Her father, Miguel, was described not just as an operator, but as an outspoken steward for his local chapter. The articles detailed tense standoffs between the rail union leadership, who worried about budget cuts, and younger workers, who feared for their lives due to crumbling infrastructure and accelerated construction schedules in deep tunnel projects. Her father hadn't disappeared because he was weak. He disappeared because he was brave. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a workers' struggle, a historical fight for human safety against corporate greed. The vindication was a powerful surge, a wave of warmth that temporarily eased the cold dread of Kessler's warning. She read an old quote attributed to her father in one article. "Safety is not optional. My life and the lives of my co-workers are not footnotes on a city budget." That was him, the man of duty, the protector. She pressed her fingers against his quoted words, feeling closer to him than she had since she was a little girl. Harold, watching her face, reached deep into a heavy storage box marked "Union Scraps" and produced a water-stained, canvas-bound ledger, thick and smelling faintly of mildew. "This," he said, laying it gently on the table, "is what shut me down. I found a copy shortly after your father vanished, but before I could get any traction, the city and the union leadership declared it inaccurate and inflammatory. I kept it anyway. It was a local union attendance and safety ledger from 1975, a dense, handwritten catalog of subway personnel, their schedules, and most importantly, records of on-the-job injuries. As Anna flipped through the pages, her heart sank. Dozens of names were scrawled in different handwritings, but several were bracketed or heavily crossed out. Beside those names were scrawled notes: "Fell during repair," "Electric short, tragic end," or the ominous "accident, RIP." It was a record of tragedy disguised as bureaucracy. The wave of hope retreated, replaced by a cold, crushing fear. It wasn't just her father. This was evidence of multiple lives cut short, probably dozens, simply scrubbed clean by bureaucratic ink. She realized Kessler's warning had merit. This was a conspiracy not just against one man, but against an entire block of outspoken workers. The sheer scale of the historical outrage fueled Anna, pushing her forward despite the danger. Suddenly, her finger froze on a column of names toward the end of the book. Under the entry for Reyes M., operator, her father's name, she noted a small detail that brought back that rush of powerful electric hope. While many men around him had their names crossed out and labeled as accident victims, Miguel Reyes's name was not crossed out. It remained intact, active, suspended in the amber of 1975. The implication was stark. If he had been a genuine accident victim, he would have been recorded and marked out like the others, immediately categorized as a casualty of the expansion. The fact that his name remained suggested that his vanishing was handled separately, unique to the others, treated not as an accidental death, but as a deliberate removal or, officially, as a desertion. The city went out of its way to categorize him differently, to erase his story entirely rather than just categorize him as one of many unfortunate deaths. This difference, this clean escape from the fatal black X of the accident victims, felt like a win, proving he successfully resisted something, confirming he didn't give up his principles. Anna focused on finding the names immediately adjacent to her father's. One name, Diaz, P., maintainer, was not crossed out, but next to it was a penciled note, almost illegible. Retired early. Medical necessity. Harold explained that Diaz was known to be a particularly hard-line advocate for tunnel safety. His early retirement seemed incredibly convenient. This P. Diaz might have been the one person who knew what happened in that chaotic final month. They had to find him. Using city records and cross-referencing old phone books, Harold tracked down a current address for a man matching the age and description in a far corner of the city. Hope swelled again. This was the breakthrough, the chance to finally talk to a witness. This was the moment she could start moving the fight into the light. It was already late when they drove through the tired, quiet streets of the industrial neighborhood. Anna's resolve was steel. The thought of talking to a contemporary of her father filled her with nervous anticipation. Pedro Diaz's small house was neat but faded, and he answered the door slowly, peering at them through the chain lock. He was a small man with deep-set, frightened eyes that seemed too big for his face, eyes that still carried the stress of years working underground. Anna introduced herself, emphasizing her father's name, Miguel Reyes, trying to keep her voice gentle and appealing. She pulled out the photo of the logbook entry, the one that proved Miguel hadn't run. Diaz finally unlatched the door, looking not at her but nervously over her shoulder. Anna felt a rush of adrenaline. He knew something. He led them into his dimly lit living room, the air thick with unspoken fear. He didn't offer them a seat. Anna explained the train discovery, the whistle, the growing evidence of a safety cover-up that cost lives. She showed him the union ledger with his name and her father's, hoping the familiarity would prompt a connection. For a moment she saw something shift in Diaz's eyes, a flicker of loyalty, maybe regret, perhaps even the beginning of the story. She pressed the point, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Mr. Diaz, my father fought for safety. He didn't run. If you know anything about what they did to him, to any of the workers, you have to tell us. The city is still lying about it. Kessler is in charge now." The mention of Kessler's name was a mistake. Diaz's face crumpled instantly. All traces of memory, of recognition, of possible help vanished. The air thickened with a sudden, overwhelming wave of fear radiating from the older man. His eyes darted to the window, the chain lock, the door, everywhere but Anna's face. The sense of belonging, the feeling of shared history she had reached for, was instantly and violently destroyed. This was the fall, the terrifying realization that the conspiracy had not faded with time. It still held people hostage. "I was never part of that," Diaz mumbled, shaking his head rapidly. "I retired early. I haven't worked on the subway in 40 years. I don't know any Miguel Reyes." His voice was high and tight, bordering on panicked. "You need to leave. You need to stop talking about those times. You need to let it go." Anna reached out instinctively, wanting to comfort him, to reassure him that they were seeking justice, not trouble. "We only want the truth." But he recoiled violently, taking 3 fast, staggering steps backward, nearly tripping over an end table. His eyes were wide with terror. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger at her. "Don't dig him back up, girl," he hissed, his voice raw. "Do you hear me? Don't you dare dig him back up!" Before Anna could say another word, he darted back across the room, wrenched the door open, and with a sudden, panicked slam that rattled the windows, he pushed them back onto the porch. Anna stood there in shock, Harold at her side. She listened as the chain lock was violently thrown across the frame. Then, 2 heavy deadbolts slid home, one right after the other. It wasn't a dismissal, it was terror. Diaz hadn't just told them to leave, he had warned them off. He had demonstrated, with stark, undeniable fear, the powerful and enduring influence of the organization that had buried Miguel Reyes and the others. The emotional low was brutal, leaving Ana cold and frustrated. She had almost had a witness, almost tasted the truth, only to have the door slammed in her face by pure, paralyzing fear. This meant Kessler wasn't just intimidating the families now. His organization, whatever it was still capable of controlling the surviving players, even 40 years later. The encounter closed Chapter 3 with a chilling, immediate threat. Someone was watching. The terror in Pedro Diaz's eyes haunted Ana for days. It was a suffocating presence, a constant reminder that this was not a historical mystery she was solving from a safe distance. This was a living, breathing conspiracy, and its fear still had a stranglehold on the city's memory. The pressure began to manifest in small, insidious ways. Kessler was a master of the indirect threat, a phantom puppet master pulling strings she couldn't see. A few days after their visit to Diaz, Ana was called into her supervisor's office at the hospital. Her name, once synonymous with reliability, was now being linked to the sensational headlines about the ghost train. She felt the chill of her professional life suddenly being at risk. Her supervisor, a woman named Janice, who had always valued Ana's steady presence, looked uncomfortable. "Ana," she began, avoiding her gaze, "we've had a couple of, let's call them, concerned inquiries from the city administrator's office. They were asking about your well-being, suggesting you might be under stress." Ana's blood ran cold. It wasn't an official warning. It was a soft, bureaucratic garrote, tightening around her reputation. Janice continued, her voice strained. "They mentioned your family's difficult history, this business with your father. They hinted that you were getting a reputation for chasing conspiracy theories. Ana, you know how much this hospital values its relationship with the city. I need you to understand that whatever you're doing in your private time, it can't affect your work here, and it is beginning to." The message was delivered with a velvet glove, but the fist inside was pure iron. "Fall in line, or your 30-year career will become collateral damage." Ana felt a surge of defiant anger, but she held it back. She was a nurse. She knew how to stay calm under pressure. She assured Janice she was fine, that her work was her priority, but the warning echoed in her ears. Kessler wasn't just watching her. He was poisoning the wells of her life, turning her sanctuary into another front in this invisible war. The conversation with her supervisor had been a body blow, but the one she had with her brother later that day broke her heart. Since their first angry phone call, Luis had been avoiding her, a silent, stubborn wall between them. Finally, needing to feel the anchor of family, even a strained one, she drove to his auto shop after her shift. He was underneath a vintage Mustang, the air thick with the smell of oil and solvent. He didn't emerge when she called his name. She had to crouch down to see his face, shadowed by the car's undercarriage. He refused to look at her. "Luis, please," she said, her voice small. "We have to talk about this." He slid out from under the car on his wheeled creeper, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. His face was a mask of exhausted fury. "There's nothing to talk about, Ana," he said, his voice flat. "I saw your picture in the paper, standing by that tunnel. You look so proud. You have no idea what you've done, do you?" The hope she'd felt at their shared history, the faint belief that he would join her, was completely destroyed by his accusation. "I'm doing this for him, Luis," she insisted, gesturing uselessly. "For us. Don't you want to know what really happened?" He threw the rag onto his toolbox with a loud smack. "I know what happened," he snarled, his voice rising. "What happened is our mother had to work 2 jobs to keep us from starving. What happened is that I got into fights every other week at school because kids called our dad a coward who ran off. What happened is that we became the sad Reyes kids with the missing father. That's what happened, Ana. And I finally got people to stop looking at me that way. And you're dragging us right back into that public shame, putting us and our kids back in the spotlight for what? A 40-year-old mystery? He's gone. Nothing you do will bring him back." Every word was a hammer blow, striking at the deepest parts of her guilt and her grief. He saw her quest not as a search for justice, but as an act of profound selfishness, a betrayal of the quiet, fragile peace he had fought so hard to build. The chasm between them had become a canyon. He turned his back on her, a final, heartbreaking dismissal. "Stay away from me and my family, Anna," he said without turning around. "I mean it." Anna walked away from the garage, her brother's anger a physical weight on her shoulders, leaving her more alone than she had ever felt. Desperate and isolated, she drove not home, but back to Harold's. The old journalist had become her only port in a storm that was growing more violent by the hour. She found him hunched over the Union Ledger again, a magnifying glass in his hand. Her despair must have been written on her face because he took one look at her and pushed a cup of black coffee into her hands without a word. She told him about Janice, about Luis, about the suffocating feeling that Kessler's net was tightening around her. She felt hopeless, like she was fighting a ghost with her bare hands. But Harold wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ledger, a strange, intense light in his eyes. He had found something. Tucked into the crease of the book's binding, near her father's name, was something they had missed. The margin was thick, 2 pages almost glued together by age and damp. Carefully, with the tip of a penknife, he separated them. Pressed between the pages was a small, sealed envelope, yellowed with age, with no name or address on it. Anna's breath caught. It had been hidden, deliberately. With trembling fingers, she took the envelope. It was impossibly light. She tore it open. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was her father's. She'd know it anywhere, even though it was more hurried, more slanted than she remembered. It was a short, unsigned letter, addressed to her mother. The words leaped off the page, grabbing her by the throat. "If I don't come home," it read, "it is because they forced my hand. This is not my choice. They know I will not be silent. Protect the children. Keep them safe. This is all that matters." The letter was a thunderclap, an emotional earthquake. It was his voice, reaching across 40 years of silence. It was proof. He was a protector, not a deserter. He had been preparing for the worst, trying to shield his family from the fallout he knew was coming. The crushing weight of Luis's accusations and her supervisor's warnings momentarily lifted, replaced by a surge of profound, heartbreaking love and validation. He had been thinking of them. His last act was to try to protect them. This artifact, this final, desperate message, was not just a clue, it was a testament. It was the emotional high she so desperately needed, a beacon in the darkness. The triumphant feeling lasted until she was driving home later that night. A storm had rolled in, rain lashing against her windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. The streets were dark and empty. She was a few blocks from her house when she turned onto a quiet residential street. Halfway down the block, her engine sputtered. Once, twice, then it died completely. The car rolled to a silent stop under a flickering streetlight, the rain drumming on the roof, the only sound in a world that had suddenly gone dead. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. Not even a click. The battery was dead. But it was a new battery. Luis had put it in himself just last month. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. It felt too perfect, too convenient. This wasn't a random breakdown. This felt targeted. She locked the doors, her heart hammering against her ribs. The street was deserted. The houses on either side were dark. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She pulled out her phone to call for a tow truck, but her hands were shaking too much. Headlights appeared in her rearview mirror, blindingly bright. A dark sedan, moving slowly, deliberately, pulled up and stopped about 20 feet behind her. It just sat there, engine idling, its high beams pinning her in place. No one got out. The minutes stretched into an eternity. This was it. The move from social and professional pressure to something tangible, something physical. It was Kessler's next move, a clear, unmistakable act of intimidation. This was sabotage. They could get to her car. They could get to her anytime, anywhere. After what felt like a lifetime, the sedan's headlights dipped, and it slowly, silently pulled around her car and drove off into the rainy night. She was left alone in the dark, in a dead car, with the terrifying knowledge that the fight was no longer about records and memories, it was about her own safety. Her father's letter was a promise of his love, but her dead car, on a stormy night, was a promise of what would happen if she didn't stop. The chapter ended on this moment of profound vulnerability, leaving Anna stranded in the darkness with a question she couldn't answer. What would they do next? The sabotage of her car marked a turning point. The fear was real now, a coiling snake in Anna's gut, but it had an unintended effect. It sharpened her resolve into a weapon. They wouldn't have resorted to such tactics if she wasn't getting close. Kessler was rattled. That knowledge was a sliver of light in the suffocating darkness. After a sleepless night, she met Harold at a quiet diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a perpetually simmering coffee pot. She told him about the car, about the silent, watching sedan. The color drained from his face, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a solemn gravity. He understood the stakes. He slid a thick, rolled-up tube across the table. "I've been digging in the city archives," he said, his voice low. "Real archives, not the public stuff. The architectural division. I pulled the original blueprints for the subway expansion, Section 7, from 1974. He unrolled the tube. The blueprint was a sprawling, intricate web of blue lines on aging paper. It smelled of dust and secrets. He pointed to a section near where her father's train was found. "Officially, this is all solid bedrock," he said, tapping a large, empty space on the map. "But look here." He used the end of a spoon to trace a faint, almost invisible dotted line that formed a small rectangle within the bedrock. "This isn't a geological marking. This is an engineering notation for an unrecorded utility chamber, a void. It's not on any subsequent map. It's as if it was drawn and then erased from history. A hidden chamber. A place to make things or people disappear." The thought was electrifying. Hope surged through Anna, fierce and undeniable. This was the X on the treasure map, the physical location where the answers had to be. If they could get inside, they could find what Kessler and his predecessors had buried. They now had a target. To confirm their theory, they needed help from someone on the inside. Harold knew a man, an archivist named Arthur Finch, who worked in the city records department. Finch was a quiet, meticulous man in his late 50s, a lifer who cared more about the integrity of historical documents than he did about city politics. Harold had used him as a source for years, and he trusted him implicitly. Finch was their key. Anna and Harold met him in the hushed, cavernous reading room of the city library. Finch was nervous, constantly adjusting his glasses and glancing over his shoulder, but he was fascinated by the mystery. He believed that records should tell the truth, and the idea of a blueprint being altered offended his professional soul. He agreed to help, promising to cross-reference the original blueprint with any construction change orders or maintenance logs from that specific tunnel section in 1975. "If a chamber was sealed, there would have to be a paper trail," Finch whispered, his eyes gleaming with scholarly excitement. "Even a cover-up leaves a shadow." The feeling of having another ally, an expert on their side who knew the bureaucratic maze they were navigating, was an incredible relief. For the first time, Anna felt like they had a team. They were no longer two outsiders poking at a fortress. They had a man on the inside. It felt like a significant emotional high, a moment of real progress. 2 days later, Arthur Finch called Harold from a payphone, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and triumph. He had found it. A single misfiled work order from October of 1975, just days after her father's disappearance. It was an emergency requisition for an unscheduled structural reinforcement in Section 7. The order was for a massive quantity of concrete and was signed off by a junior deputy in the planning department, a young Richard Kessler. It was the smoking gun, the direct link between Kessler and the sealing of the tunnel. Finch had made a copy and hidden it. He told Harold he'd bring it to him the next day. The news sent a jolt of adrenaline through Anna. They had him. They had the proof. She allowed herself a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. Justice felt close enough to touch. They were going to expose him, clear her father's name, and bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. The next morning they waited for Finch at the diner. He was 10 minutes late, then 20. Harold called his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in Anna's chest. This wasn't like Arthur. He was pathologically punctual. After an hour, Harold drove to his small apartment. The door was unlocked. Inside, the place was in perfect order, except for one thing. Arthur Finch was gone. His wallet and keys were on the kitchen counter. His car was still in its assigned parking spot, but he had vanished. A frantic call to his office at the records department delivered the final, devastating blow. The department head told Harold that Mr. Finch had submitted his resignation via email late last night, effective immediately, citing a family emergency and a sudden move out of state. The betrayal was stunning, a gut punch that left Anna breathless. He hadn't just disappeared, he had run. And he hadn't just run. He had cleaned up his tracks, creating a neat official story that erased him completely. But why? Then the awful truth settled in. Kessler had gotten to him. Finch wasn't a willing participant in the cover-up. He was a victim of it. He had been turned. The ally they had trusted, the man who was supposed to be their key, was now a liability. He was feeding every question they asked, every theory they had, straight back to the man they were trying to expose. Kessler now knew exactly what they were looking for. He knew about the blueprint. He knew about the hidden chamber. The hope of the last few days evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. They had been played, beautifully and completely. Later that evening, feeling defeated, Anna went with Harold back to the archives, using his old pass to get into the architectural division one more time before anyone connected them to Finch's disappearance. They looked at the original blueprint again, the one Arthur had shown them. It was then that Anna, her eyes scanning every inch of the paper in desperation, saw something new. In the margin, near the notation for the hidden chamber, was a tiny, almost invisible penciled note, written in a different hand than the engineering specs. It was faint, as if someone had written it and then tried to erase it. She had to hold it under a desk lamp at just the right angle to read the words. North vent, locked from inside. A vent, a secondary access point, one that could only be secured from within the chamber itself. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, that Kessler's men would have missed it. It was a message left by one of the original engineers, perhaps, a breadcrumb of conscience left for someone to find 40 years later. It was a tiny flicker of hope in the overwhelming despair, a new path forward just as the old one had been violently shut down. They now knew where to look. They had to get back into that tunnel and find the north vent. Harold, calling on his last reserves of journalistic charm and old-school grit, managed to arrange a formal access permit for Anna as next of kin, allowing her a final, supervised walkthrough of the site before the train was to be removed. The emotional whiplash was staggering. One moment they were betrayed and exposed, the next they had a new, secret advantage. They had a plan, but Kessler was always one step ahead. The day before their scheduled visit, a call came from the city administrator's office. Anna's permit had been revoked. The reason given was newly identified safety concerns regarding structural integrity. It was a lie, and a transparent one at that. Kessler had used the information he'd gotten from Finch to shut down their one remaining legal path. He had cut them off completely. The finality of it was crushing. Every door they opened, he slammed shut. Every step forward they took, he pushed them 2 steps back. He was toying with them, demonstrating his power, showing them that they were utterly, hopelessly outmatched. Anna was left with a terrible choice: give up and let her father's memory be slandered forever, or break the law and risk everything to find the truth herself. The chapter closes on this precipice, this agonizing low point. They have the knowledge, they have the target, but they have no way to get to it. The system had closed ranks around them, and their enemy now knew their every move. The only path left was the one that led into darkness. Kessler's final move was both brutal and predictable. The city, citing the same fabricated safety concerns, held a press conference. Anna watched it on the small TV in Harold's bungalow, her stomach churning with a mixture of rage and helplessness. There, on the screen, was Richard Kessler, his face a mask of civic concern, announcing that the historic ghost train would be removed and scrapped within 48 hours. He called it a necessary step to ensure the continued safety of our modern transit system and to finally close a painful, yet ultimately resolved, chapter in our city's history. He was not just burying the evidence, he was erasing the entire crime scene, melting it down for scrap so it could never speak again. The clock had started ticking. 48 hours. The blatant public display of institutional power was infuriating. Kessler was taunting them, demonstrating that he could rewrite history in broad daylight, and the city would thank him for it. This was the moment of decision. The system was rigged, the legal doors were barred, and the truth was about to be turned into slag metal. Anna looked at Harold, his face grim, the gears turning behind his tired eyes. "We're going in," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, and it was, she knew, a reckless decision, a step off a cliff into pure, unknown danger. She was a nurse, a grandmother, a woman who had lived her entire life by the rules, and now she was about to become a criminal for a man she barely remembered but whose honor she would die to protect. The desperation was a fire in her veins. This was a flawed, dangerous choice, born of love and fury, and she knew a part of the world would look at her and see a woman who had lost her mind. But she didn't care. She was her father's daughter, and he had not been silent. Neither would she. That night, under the cloak of a moonless, overcast sky, they put their desperate plan into motion. Harold, using his knowledge of the city's underbelly, had found an access point 3 blocks from the sealed tunnel, an old, forgotten maintenance grate in a back alley that smelled of garbage and rain. It was rusted shut, but Harold, surprisingly spry for a man in his 70s, had brought a crowbar. The screech of tortured metal as he pried it open was deafening in the silence of the alley. Anna's heart hammered against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. This was no longer an investigation, it was an infiltration. They descended a rickety iron ladder into the pitch-black guts of the city. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of stagnant water and decay. They had headlamps, 2-way radios, and a backpack filled with water, a first aid kit, and a ball of twine and a piece of chalk to mark their path, a grim parody of Hansel and Gretel. Harold had insisted on safety measures. Buddy system, chalk lines, radio checks every 5 minutes, he'd said, his voice all business. "We're not going to be the next people to disappear down here." His calm, procedural approach was a small island of comfort in an ocean of fear. Anna felt a surge of deep, profound gratitude for this old, stubborn journalist who was risking his own safety for her family's truth. Down here, in the oppressive dark, he was her only lifeline. The tunnels were a labyrinth, a confusing maze of intersecting passages and abandoned tracks. The only sounds were their own footsteps, the drip of water from the vaulted ceiling, and the distant, low rumble of a train passing somewhere in the active parts of the system. It was disorienting, terrifying. Anna fought down the rising panic, focusing on Harold's chalk marks, on the crackle of his voice over the radio. "Check in, Anna." "Checking in," she'd reply, her own voice sounding thin and shaky. After what felt like hours, they found it. The rough, unfinished concrete of the wall that had sealed her father's tomb, it was even more menacing up close, a brutal scar of modern construction on the old brickwork. They followed the wall, their headlamps cutting feeble beams through the darkness, until they found what they were looking for, the north vent. It was a heavy iron grill, about 3 feet square, set low on the wall near the floor. And just as the blueprint had promised, it was bolted not from their side, but from the inside. Except for one detail the blueprint hadn't shown. A single thick rusted bolt on the outside was loose, as if someone had tried to secure it in a hurry and failed. It was their way in. Working together, panting with exertion in the stale air, they managed to work the grill free. The opening was small, a dark, unwelcoming square. This was the point of no return. On the other side of that hole lay the truth, or a trap. Anna looked at Harold, and in the beam of her headlamp she saw his fear, but also his determination. He nodded. She was going in first. She squeezed through the opening, scraping her jacket on the rough edges, and dropped onto the dusty floor inside. She was there. She was inside the sealed tunnel. The silence was absolute, heavier and more profound than in the outer tunnels. This was a place where sound had died 40 years ago. Her headlamp beam cut through the darkness, landing first on the hulking shape of the train, a silent, sleeping beast. Then, as she swept the light across the interior of the cab, it glinted off something on the floor near the operator's seat. It was a heavy-duty emergency lantern, the kind transit workers used. But it wasn't covered in the same thick, uniform layer of dust as everything else. Near the handle, the dust was disturbed. In the fine gray powder were the faint, preserved outlines of fingerprints. Someone had picked it up, used it, and put it down right before this place was sealed forever. Her father's fingerprints. It was another piece of him, another silent testament. He hadn't been sitting and waiting. He had been active, moving, using his tools. A wave of connection washed over her, a feeling of being in his presence, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. This was the emotional high she had risked everything for, the feeling of standing in his footsteps, of being so close to him she could almost hear his voice. The feeling was shattered by a sound from behind her. It wasn't Harold, it was a different sound. The crunch of a heavy boot on loose gravel coming from the access tunnel they had just left. Someone had followed them. Her blood turned to ice. She scrambled back to the vent, her heart pounding. "Harold," she whispered into her radio, her voice cracking. "Someone's here. Get out, now." She heard a scuffle, a grunt of pain, then a loud clatter as something metallic hit the concrete floor. "Harold?" she cried, louder this time. Silence. Then, his voice, strained and breathless. "Security! They found the grate! Anna, they're coming! Run!" A new set of flashlight beams sliced through the darkness from the far end of the access tunnel, moving quickly, methodically, towards them. She could hear the voices now, sharp and authoritative. "Spread out! Check all these passages!" Panic seized her. She couldn't leave Harold. She started to climb back through the vent, but his voice crackled over the radio again, desperate and commanding. "No, go, get the proof, don't let this be for nothing." Through the grill she saw him. He was on the ground, clutching his leg, his face pale with pain in the harsh glare of the approaching lights. He had fallen. In the split second of his own vulnerability, he was still thinking of the mission, of her. He was sacrificing his own escape for hers. The security guards were almost on him. "Go, Anna!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the tunnel. Tears streamed down her face. It was the most agonizing decision of her life. To stay would mean they both got caught and the truth would be buried forever. To run felt like a betrayal of the only person who had stood by her. But his words, "Don't let this be for nothing," rang in her ears. With a sob of anguish, she pushed the heavy vent grill back into place from her side, the sound of its metal frame grating against the concrete, a final, brutal sound of separation. She was now alone, trapped in the darkness of her father's tomb, while her only ally was being captured by the enemy. The chapter ends here, on this cliffhanger of absolute despair, Anna on one side of the wall, Harold on the other, both of them now caught in Kessler's web. The hours that followed were a blur of cold, suffocating darkness and the crushing weight of failure. Anna remained huddled in the sealed tunnel, her headlamp switched off to conserve the battery, listening to the muffled sounds of the security team searching the outer passages. The radio was silent. Harold was gone. The guilt was a physical sickness, a sour knot in her stomach. She had led him into a trap. His last, desperate act was to save her, and she had abandoned him. Eventually, the sounds outside faded. Silence reclaimed the tunnels. Using the emergency exit protocols Harold had drilled into her, she found a different maintenance ladder at the far end of the tunnel network, emerging through a sewer grate into the pre-dawn gray of an industrial park miles from where they had started. She walked for what felt like an eternity, a ghost in her own city, until she finally hailed a cab, her clothes streaked with grime and her face a mask of exhaustion and despair. She felt utterly, completely crushed. She had failed her father. She had lost her only ally, and she was now a fugitive. She went to the one place she had sworn she wouldn't, the one place she knew she couldn't be turned away, her brother's house. Luis opened the door before she could knock, as if he'd been waiting. His face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, anger, worry, and a deep, weary sadness. He took in her disheveled state, the dirt on her face, the wild look in her eyes, and for a moment, the anger won. "Look at you," he said, his voice a low, bitter growl. "What have you done, Anna? What in God's name have you done now?" She stumbled inside, the story pouring out of her in a ragged, broken torrent, the hidden chamber, the illegal entry, Harold's capture, her escape. She expected him to yell, to tell her, "I told you so," to throw her out. But he didn't. He just stood there, his mechanic's hands, usually so capable and sure, hanging uselessly at his sides. The anger in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a dawning horror. "You're risking everything," he whispered, the words not an accusation, but a statement of terrified fact. "You're going to lose your job. You could go to jail. You're dragging our family's last shred of dignity through the mud for a ghost." The familiar argument felt different this time. It wasn't just about the shame of the past, it was about the very real danger of the present. He was scared for her. Beneath the decades of resentment and fear, a flicker of brotherly protection, however faint, still burned. But it wasn't enough to bridge the canyon between them. The conversation was a descent into a deep, emotional low, a confirmation of her utter isolation. Even in her desperation, she could not make him understand. Her phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound in the tense silence of Luis's living room. It was a restricted number. Her hand shook as she answered it. The voice on the other end was familiar, not because she knew the person, but because she recognized the tone, the clipped, professional weariness of a man who delivers bad news for a living. It was Harold's lawyer. He told her that Harold was in custody, charged with trespassing and destruction of city property. He had a sprained ankle from the fall. But that wasn't the worst of it. The lawyer's voice dropped. "He wants you to know he's considering quitting, Anna," the lawyer said. "He's 75 years old. He says he's too old for this fight. He told me to tell you that he's sorry, but he can't see a way to win. The city is throwing the book at him." The news was a physical blow. Harold, her rock, her partner, the one person who had believed, was giving up. The last pillar of her support had crumbled, leaving her completely alone in the wreckage. She hung up the phone, a hollow feeling of defeat settling over her. Maybe Luis was right. Maybe Harold was right. Maybe this was an unwinnable war. She had chased a ghost, and in the process, she had ruined lives, fractured her family, and accomplished nothing. The weight of it all was suffocating. And then, Kessler made his final, most arrogant move. That afternoon, he held another press conference, this one broadcast on every major news channel. He stood at a podium, flanked by city officials, his face a perfect picture of calm authority. He announced the unfortunate incident of an elderly, disgruntled former journalist who had illegally entered the subway system, perpetuating a harmful and baseless conspiracy theory. He painted Harold as a confused old man, and by extension he painted Anna as a delusional hysteric. But the true villainy was in his final words. He smiled, a thin, predatory smile, and looked directly into the camera. "With this sad episode behind us," he said, "the city can now move forward. We are pleased to say that the memory of Miguel Reyes, a man who tragically abandoned his post 40 years ago, will no longer be tarnished by these reckless myths. The city of today honors its history by closing this chapter with the truth. He was cementing the lie. He was using her failure, her desperation, to carve the official story into stone, branding her father a deserter for all time. He was winning, and the entire city was cheering him on for it. Watching him stand there, so confident, so untouchable, something inside Anna broke. The despair, the guilt, the fear, it all burned away in a sudden, clarifying fire of pure, undiluted rage. No, he would not win, not like this. He would not use her pain to build his victory. She looked at Luis, her eyes blazing. "He is not a myth," she said, her voice trembling with a power she didn't know she possessed. She remembered the letter, the one she'd found pressed in the Union ledger. "If I don't come home," they forced my hand. "Protect the children." It wasn't just a message, it was a charge. A sacred duty passed from a father to a daughter across 40 years of silence. Her father hadn't given up, even when he knew he was going to die. He had faced down a corrupt system to protect his family, and she was his daughter. She would not let that truth die in the dark. In that moment, a new resolve settled over her, harder and colder than anything she had felt before. This was no longer just about clearing his name, it was about fulfilling his final wish. The rage and pain had transformed into a singular, unwavering purpose. The fight had entered the red zone. All the normal rules were gone. Her job, her reputation, even her own safety, no longer mattered. All that mattered was the promise. Harold's voice came back to her from the darkness of the tunnel. "Don't let this be for nothing." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was her father's brass whistle. And next to it, something else she had retrieved from Harold's archives before their descent, her father's old wristwatch. The police had returned it to her mother in 1975. A simple silver-plated timepiece. It had stopped at 9:14 p.m., the exact time the power was cut to his section of the track on the night he vanished. It wasn't just a watch, it was a timestamp for a murder. Clutching the watch in her hand, she knew what she had to do. She was going back, alone. This time she wasn't going to look for clues. She was going to find that chamber. She would either come back with the truth, or she wouldn't come back at all. She stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. She walked to the door, a soldier marching into her final battle. Luis called after her, his voice tight with panic. "Anna, where are you going? Don't do this, it's over." She paused at the door and looked back at her brother, her face set like stone. "It's not over," she said. "He asked me to protect us, and I'm going to keep his promise." The chapter closes on this note of desperate, heroic resolve, the emotional high of a renewed purpose born from the depths of defeat, leaving the audience breathless as she steps back into the lion's den, completely alone and with the clock ticking down to 0. The return to the tunnels was different. This time there was no Harold, no backup, no safety net. There was only the cold, hard resolve of a daughter on a final, desperate mission. Anna moved with a speed and certainty that surprised even herself, navigating the labyrinthine passages not with fear, but with a grim sense of purpose. Every shadow, every drip of water, was a familiar ghost. She found the sealed tunnel, slipped through the north vent, and stood once more in the silent, dust-choked air of her father's tomb. She did not hesitate. Her headlamp beam cut a steady path through the darkness, bypassing the train, bypassing the lantern, focusing solely on the far wall of the tunnel. The blueprint had shown the chamber there. She ran her hands along the cold, rough-hewn rock, searching for a seam, a crack, anything that suggested a hidden entrance. Her heart pounded with a frantic rhythm, a drumbeat of hope and dread. For a terrifying moment, she found nothing but solid rock. The despair threatened to swamp her again. Had they been wrong? Was this all for nothing? Then her light caught it. Behind a thick cluster of electrical conduits that had been bolted to the wall decades after the tunnel was sealed, the texture of the rock changed. It was smoother, flatter. It was concrete, skillfully textured to look like the surrounding stone, an almost perfect camouflage. Behind the conduits was the hidden seam of a doorway. With renewed vigor, she began to pull at the heavy metal pipes. They were bolted tight, but 40 years of neglect had worked in her favor. Rust had eaten at the bolts. Using a tire iron she'd taken from the trunk of her disabled car, she put her entire weight into it, grunting with the effort. One by one, the bolts groaned, then snapped. The conduits came loose, crashing to the floor with a deafening clang that echoed through the dead space. And there it was. The outline of a small rectangular maintenance door, sealed not with a lock, but with plaster and concrete. This was it. This was the place. The final surge of adrenaline hit her. She hammered at the seal with the tire iron, chipping away at the hard plaster, ignoring the stinging pain in her hands as blisters formed and broke. She worked like a woman possessed, driven by a 40-year-old promise. Finally, a chunk of the seal broke free, revealing a dark, hollow space beyond. The air that puffed out was colder, more stagnant than the air in the tunnel. It was the smell of a place that had been deliberately starved of oxygen, a place meant to stay hidden forever. She cleared the rest of the opening, and aiming her headlamp into the void, she crawled inside. It was not a chamber, it was a grave, The space was small, no bigger than a closet. Lying in a jumble on the floor were a half-dozen dusty, discarded hard hats. Propped against the back wall were two faded, hand-painted protest signs. One read, "Safety before profit." The other, "We are men, not numbers." This was the proof. This was the heart of the cover-up. They hadn't just silenced one man. They had cornered a group of them in here, the last holdouts of the safety protest, and had simply walled them in. The emotional impact was staggering. It wasn't just about her father anymore. This was a mass murder, a crime against a whole group of men whose only offense was demanding to go home to their families alive. The scale of the injustice was overwhelming, a wave of sickness and fury that left her dizzy. Her father hadn't been a lone victim. He was a leader, silenced along with his most loyal men. The truth was so much bigger, so much darker, than she had ever imagined. Her light fell on one helmet in particular, set apart from the others. It was an operator's cap, not a worker's hard hat. Her father's. Tucked into the worn leather band inside, she found a small, folded piece of cardstock. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. It was a prayer card, the kind her mother used to keep in her purse. On the back, in her father's familiar, steady script, was a final, heartbreaking message. "Lord, protect Anna and Luis. I did my duty." He had been thinking of them, even in his last moments, trapped in the dark, facing his own end. He had done his duty. He had not failed. He had protected his men to the last. The prayer card was a final, intimate connection, a whisper of love from beyond the grave. Tears streamed down Anna's face, silent, hot tracks through the grime on her cheeks. She held the card to her chest, the brittle paper, a sacred relic. She had found him. Not his body, but his soul, his final testament. The sense of closure, of profound, bittersweet love, was a powerful, emotional crescendo. He was not a deserter. He was a hero. A sudden, sharp scrape of a shoe on concrete from the tunnel behind her shattered the moment. Her blood ran cold. She spun around, her headlamp beam cutting through the darkness of the doorway. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the outer tunnel. And then he stepped forward, into the beam of her light. It was Richard Kessler. His suit was immaculate, unruffled, as if he had just stepped out of a boardroom. He wasn't alone. Two large, stone-faced men in dark work coats flanked him. Kessler's face was no longer a mask of calm, political charm. It was a face of cold, reptilian fury. He had followed her, or he had been waiting. The terror was immediate, primal. She was cornered, trapped in a tomb with the man who had built it. He looked around the small chamber, his gaze dismissive, landing on the protest signs with a contemptuous sneer. "Such drama," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. They were holding up progress, threatening the future of this entire city over a few rusty bolts and some cracked concrete. They were a problem. He looked directly at Anna, and for the first time she saw not a bureaucrat but a predator. "So we buried the problem," he confessed, the words utterly devoid of remorse. "Before it buried the city. Your father was the worst of them, a stubborn fool who thought his little principles were more important than a billion-dollar infrastructure project." He forced our hand. The confession was chilling in its casual cruelty. He wasn't confessing to a crime, he was explaining a business decision. He took a step forward, and one of his men handed him a small can of lighter fluid and a pack of matches. The intent was terrifyingly clear. He was going to destroy the evidence, all of it, including her. "It's a shame," Kessler said, his voice almost conversational as he began to douse the old, dry protest signs with the fluid. "You had a quiet life, a respectable career, but like father, like daughter, too stubborn for your own good." He struck a match. The flame flared to life, casting flickering, demonic shadows on the walls of the chamber. This was it. The end. She was going to die here, just like her father, her story, and his silenced forever by fire and smoke. But in that instant, a sound cut through the tense silence. It was the crackle of a radio, loud and clear, coming from the tunnel behind Kessler. A voice, familiar and breathless, echoed off the walls. "Anna? Anna? Can you hear me? We're coming." It was Luis, and behind him, Another voice. Harold's. "The police are right behind us. We've got you, Kessler." Kessler froze, the match burning down toward his fingers, his face contorted in a mask of pure disbelief and rage. He had underestimated them. He had underestimated the bond of family. He had underestimated the tenacity of an old reporter. In a final, desperate act of destruction, he lunged forward, throwing the lit match onto the fuel-soaked protest signs. They erupted in a whoosh of flame. The fire spread instantly, climbing the dry timber of the signs, smoke filling the small chamber. Anna scrambled backward, coughing, her eyes stinging. Kessler and his men turned to flee, but it was too late. Two figures burst into the tunnel, their flashlights blinding. The first was Luis, wielding a heavy wrench like a club, his face a mask of protective fury. The second was Harold, leaning heavily on a crutch, his other hand holding a phone, its camera recording everything. And behind them, the flashing blue and red lights of the police, their beams cutting through the smoke-filled darkness. Kessler was trapped. His face, illuminated by the flames of his own cover-up, was a picture of a man whose world was burning down around him. Justice had arrived, not with a quiet courtroom verdict, but with fire and smoke and the righteous anger of a family that had refused to stay broken. The scene in the tunnel devolved into chaos. Uniformed officers swarmed the space, their commands echoing off the rock walls as they quickly subdued Kessler and his thugs. Fire extinguishers hissed, smothering the flames and filling the air with a choking chemical fog. Through the smoke and flashing lights, Anna saw her brother. Luis dropped the wrench and rushed to her, pulling her out of the chamber and into his arms, holding her with a desperate strength that spoke more than words ever could. He wasn't just holding his sister, he was holding on to the last piece of their shared history, finally understanding the weight she had been carrying alone. "I'm sorry, Anna," he choked out, his voice thick with a guilt that was 40 years in the making. "I was so afraid of the shame, I forgot to be proud of him. I forgot to be proud of you." In that moment, the canyon between them closed. The shame that had defined their lives was finally burned away, replaced by a grief that they could now, for the first time, share. It was a reunion born in darkness and fire, a fractured family made whole again. Harold hobbled over, a triumphant, weary grin on his face. He explained in breathless bursts how Luis, consumed by worry after Anna left, had found Harold's lawyer's number on a notepad. Luis's call had been the catalyst. The lawyer, realizing the extreme danger, had used Harold's one phone call not to arrange bail, but to contact a trusted deputy police chief, an old source from Harold's reporting days. He laid out the entire conspiracy, providing just enough of the evidence Harold had compiled, the blueprints, the Union ledger, the story of Arthur Finch's disappearance, to convince the chief that something was terribly wrong. It was a long shot, a reporter's last-ditch plea to a system he no longer trusted, but it had worked. They had arrived just in the nick of time, a cavalry of justice summoned by a brother's love and a journalist's conviction. As the police led a stoic, silent Kessler away in handcuffs, the camera on Harold's phone still recording, the full weight of their victory began to settle in. It was a stunning, absolute triumph. Justice served, the hidden truth revealed. It was everything Anna had fought for. In the days and weeks that followed, the story exploded. The discovery of the hidden chamber, the testimony of a terrified but now cooperating Pedro Diaz, and the contents of Harold's meticulously kept files, unraveled a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of city government, both past and present. The names from the Union ledger, the men who were crossed out, the men who had been dismissed as tragic accidents, were finally read aloud in press conferences and city council meetings. Their families, many of whom had lived for decades with the same quiet shame as Anna and Luis, were finally given the truth. Miguel Reyes was no longer a deserter. He, along with his men, was honored as a hero, a whistleblower who had paid the ultimate price for his integrity. Statues were proposed, streets were renamed. The city, so desperate to bury its sins, was now forced to confront them in the harsh light of day. The feeling was euphoric, a powerful, emotional high that washed over Anna, Luis, and Harold. They had done the impossible. They had spoken for the dead, and the living had been forced to listen. But for Anna, The victory was bittersweet. She had her father's name back. She had the truth, she had justice, but she did not have him. In the quiet moments after the storm had passed, when the reporters had gone and the politicians had finished their speeches, a profound and unshakable sadness would settle over her. She had won the war, but the central defining loss of her life remained. No amount of public vindication could fill the void he had left behind. She would look at her grandchildren and feel a pang of sorrow that they would never know their great-grandfather, never hear his voice or feel his hand on their heads. She had cleared his legacy, but she could never share a future with him. This was the cost of victory, a quiet, personal grief that would live alongside the public triumph. Justice brought closure, but it did not bring him back. The victory was real, but so were the scars. She had unearthed the truth, but in doing so, she had excavated her own childhood wound, leaving it open and clean, but still achingly present. The final scene of their story did not take place in a crowded press conference or a sterile courtroom. It took place months later, on a quiet, crisp autumn afternoon, back at the entrance to the newly christened Reyes Memorial Tunnel. The wall had been repaired, but not replaced. Instead, a simple, elegant bronze plaque had been set into the concrete, listing the names of all the men who had been lost in 1975, Miguel Reyes, Pedro Diaz, and a dozen others. Ana stood there with Luis, a comfortable, reconciled silence between them. The city had returned their father's belongings, the few artifacts from that hidden chamber. She held the small, worn prayer card in one hand and the brass whistle in the other. She had fulfilled her promise. She had protected his memory, and in doing so, had healed her family. Luis put a steadying arm around her shoulder, his presence a quiet affirmation of all they had endured and reclaimed. With a sense of finality, Ana reached out and gently placed the whistle and the prayer card at the base of the plaque, side by side, a father's duty and his faith reunited at last. She looked at his name, the letters shining in the afternoon sun, and whispered the words she had longed to say for 40 years, the words that were both an ending and a beginning. "Your promise kept us safe," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet air. "Now I'll keep yours alive."